Okay, so looking at the Passover in the Second Temple period, how does the Passover and the understanding of it help us to understand the liturgy? So the Passover is an annual sacrifice. It takes place every year. And the Israelites did more than just recall the highlights of the first Passover and its lessons, but they actually lived it. They remembered it in a way that made it present to them. So it's not just commemorating it, it's not just celebrating it like Memorial Day, but it's making it present. So there's a more deep meaning than just remembering. So the memory and the action are intrinsically linked together, connected in the Bible. For when you remember a past event, it becomes present to you. It calls forth the power of that past event, and its full impact is then felt. So we see that it's there when you're reliving it. So if you actually look at the Passover and how it's celebrated, each person talks as if they were the ones that were brought out of Egypt, which seems slightly odd because clearly, thousands of years later, they were not the ones that were slaves in Egypt. But God, of course, is a participant in the first Passover, and God is outside of time. So he enables that original event to transcend time and therefore impact the present. So each Passover, you can then participate in the original Passover. So there's a remembering of the past, but there's also a making it present. And so this concept of Passover then is carried over to the new Passover, the Last Supper, and our liturgy. And one of the reasons that we know this and can understand it is reading the Talmud. And in the Talmud it says, in every generation, a man must so regard himself as if he came forth himself out of Egypt. For what is written, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came forth out of Egypt. It's actually from the Mishnah. Okay? So he speaks of himself as having experienced it. And it's one of those commands that you see, that they live out. So how does Jesus transform the Passover? Right? This concept of remembering, the amnesis in Greek, takes on a whole new meaning, right? And so we have that aspect in the canon of the Mass, where we have that idea of remembering, of that idea of recalling. When Jesus was at the Last Supper, right? They recall, and then they become making present that same sacrifice. So Calvary, it's not just a remembering Calvary, but a making it present. So if you read Hebrews, it says, Christ lives so as to make intercession for us. He's not dead, he's not gone, he's living, granted in heaven. He's now outside of time and transcending time, and therefore can make an event of the past present to us. But the Passover actually has two distinct parts. There's the sacrifice itself, which for the Jews' Passover, it was the lay worshipers who would sacrifice the victim. It's not the priest. And then, of course, for Christ's Passover and the Mass, Christ's sacrifice on Calvary. This is the actual sacrifice. But there's a second aspect, which is the offering of the victim. You can't complete the sacrifices without offering the victim. Otherwise, it's an incomplete sacrifice. So the place to offer the sacrificial victim to God is in the temple, in the Holy of Holies. So if we have Christ's death on Calvary, where do we then see the offering of the victim, the communing with the Holy, sprinkling the blood on the mercy seat? This takes place, of course, in heaven with God the Father. So Christ's ascension, he then offers himself to God. So we have the sacrifice, but then we also have the offering. And Sheed, in his Theology and Sanity, writes, the essence of the Mass is that Christ is making an offering to the Father of himself, who was slain for us upon Calvary. The Mass is Calvary, as Christ now offers it to his Father. So we see this juxtaposition. It's not Calvary that's necessarily relived, but Calvary is the beginning of that sacrifice, and it's completed with its offering to the Father in heaven. Right? So reading Hebrews, the ascension's necessary in order to complete it, where Christ enters into that sanctuary and places the blood that was poured out before the mercy seat of God in the Holy of Holies in heaven. Then the third aspect, of course, is the eating of the flesh, right? So we've sacrificed it, offered it, but then you actually eat the lamb. The Passover sacrifice has to be completed not just with the death and the offering, but by the eating of the flesh. So this would, of course, remind you of the taking of Holy Communion when we eat the flesh of Christ and that completion of the sacrifice. And everything about the Passover, it is referred to as a toda sacrifice, or a thank offering. So there are a few different types of sacrifice in the Mosaic covenant, which are detailed in Leviticus. Leviticus gives us all the rules for everything. So if you ever wonder about the rules, go read Leviticus. So the offerings here are detailed in Leviticus chapters 1 through 7, the beginning of the book. And so these offerings can be divided and subdivided in a number of ways, but there's a few major categories. So we have burnt offerings, we have cereal offerings, we have peace offerings, we have sin offerings, and we have guilt offerings. Now, peace offerings, that category actually included the eating of the sacrificial meal, and it's the only one in which the sacrifices were non-priests permitted to share in the eating of the meal of what was sacrificed. So these peace offerings then, the only one where we have non-priests participating in the meal, has a subcategory, which is the thank offering. So this is talked about in Leviticus 7. Right, so everything's Leviticus. Just stick in Leviticus, you're good to go. But the toda literally means thanksgiving. Basically, when we speak of the Eucharist, it's thanksgiving in Greek. Toda is thanksgiving in Hebrew. So they all just mean thanksgiving in different languages. In addition to the sense of thanksgiving, though, is gratitude. There's a strong connotation of praise. So why would we actually offer this offering? There's a basic reason, and it's one of thanksgiving for being saved. So it's not just I'm thankful for something in general, but specifically I was saved from some type of major catastrophe. I've been redeemed. And so I then come and thank God for deliverance from this danger, whatever it was. And it's generally accompanied by a type of song, generally a psalm song. There you go. So once you've been delivered, you express the gratitude by going and celebrating the sacrificial meal. So you go to the temple, make the sacrifice, offer the sacrifice, and then you take that meal, you bring it back home with the lamb that's been sacrificed and the consecrated bread that's been offered, and in that meal you then share the meat and the bread in thanksgiving with family and friends, narrating often what you were saved from. So if we think about this in terms of the liturgy, what are we saved from but death, right? So the major catastrophe that we are all destined for death, and Christ comes and conquers death. So it presupposes that narrative. It's not just a general thanksgiving, but one that specifically recounts catastrophe, being redeemed from that catastrophe, and then gratitude for that.